The first year of a marriage. It's supposed to be the honeymoon phase. That golden window where the world is just two people and a whole lot of optimism. But for Daisy, honestly, it was the beginning of an eraser. It didn't happen with a bang. No, it happened in whispers, in helpful suggestions that slowly, piece by piece, rubbed out the edges of who she was. The first thing to go was the art. I walked into their pristine townhouse one Sunday and noticed the spare room, the one that was supposed to be her studio, was hauntingly empty. The smell of linseed oil and turpentine, the scent that had defined my home for 20 years, it was gone. Replaced by the sterile, cloying aroma of expensive vanilla candles. Grayson says the fumes are a migraine trigger for him, she told me, her voice. It was lacking its usual spark. She was scrubbing a spot on the marble countertop that didn't even exist. Her movements were frantic, mechanical. My gut twisted. I felt a cold knot forming right below my ribs. But I told myself I was just being a paranoid, overprotective dad. Then, the visits started thinning out. I'd have a Sunday roast ready, the kitchen smelling of rosemary and gravy, only for the phone to ring 10 minutes before she was due. She'd give me some vague excuse about Grayson needing her home to host a last-minute associate from the firm. When I tried calling her directly, more often than not, Grayson would be the one to pick up. His voice was always smooth, like expensive bourbon. He'd tell me she was in the bath, or napping, or out on a mandatory shopping trip with his mother. I'd sit there, in my quiet living room, staring at the dust motes dancing in the light, wondering when my daughter became a ghost in her own life. On the rare occasions I actually did get her on the line, she sounded thin, like a wire stretched so tight it was vibrating on the verge of snapping. She didn't talk about her sketches or the local gallery anymore. Instead, she recited a script. Charity galas, historical preservation societies, seating charts. It was like she was reading lines written by a playwright who had never actually met her. I couldn't take the distance anymore. So, one Tuesday afternoon, I drove over without calling. I found her in the backyard, standing perfectly still by a rose bush that looked like it had been manicured with a pair of surgical scissors. The sun was hitting her face, and for the first time, I realized how translucent her skin had become. She looked like she was made of fine porcelain, just ready to shatter. When she saw me, she didn't run to give me a hug. She flinched. Her eyes darted toward the heavy oak back door, her hand flying to her throat to fiddle with a silver necklace I'd never seen before. Dad, the word. It felt like a slap. A schedule? My daughter, the girl who used to lose track of time for 8 hours straight while painting a sunset, was living by a goddamn timetable in her own home. The audacity of it. It made the hair on my arms stand up. I felt this sudden, overwhelming urge to grab her hand and pull her toward my old sedan. But the fear in her eyes, it anchored me to the spot. Then came the news that usually makes a father weep with joy. Daisy was pregnant. I wanted to believe a baby would be the reset button, that a new life would soften Grayson's sharp edges and finally turn that cold museum of a house into a home. I was a fool. Because if the marriage was an eraser, the pregnancy was a cage. Grayson turned protecting the air into a full-time psychological operation. He decided what she ate, down to the gram of protein. He decided when she slept. He even decided which approved friends she was allowed to have tea with. He cut off her access to their joint accounts, claiming it was to reduce her stress regarding finances during the 3rd trimester. He gave her a literal allowance, like she was a teenager asking for gas money. Honestly, I didn't realize how bad it was until we snuck out for a quick coffee while Grayson was at a deposition. We stood at the counter of a little cafe that smelled of roasted beans and cinnamon. When the barista called out 3 pounds, Daisy swiped her card, and it was declined. She turned a shade of crimson that made my heart ache. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at the little red light on the card reader. He must have forgotten to transfer the funds this morning, she stammered. Her fingers were trembling as she tried to shove the card back into her wallet. It breaks a man. Seeing his child stripped of basic dignity over the price of a latte, it changes you. It turns sorrow into something much more focused. The abuse wasn't physical, at least, not yet. It was financial and emotional strangulation, a slow tightening of the noose. Grayson and his mother, Beatrice, treated her like a high-end surrogate, a vessel. Beatrice was there almost every day, sipping Earl Grey and picking apart Daisy's appearance with the precision of a jeweler. "You're gaining too much weight in your face, dear," Beatrice remarked one afternoon, watching Daisy reach for a piece of toast. Grayson has always had a certain distaste for sloppy women. Daisy was 6 months pregnant. She was supposed to be gaining weight, but she just nodded and pushed the plate away. Her stomach was probably growling, but she didn't say a word. I stopped being just a worried father, and I started being a logistics manager again. I knew how to track movements. I knew how to find the weak links in a chain. I spent my retirement days in the basement of the public records office. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and floor wax. I wanted to know exactly who the prominent Sterlings were. When you peeled back the wallpaper, the smell of that damp basement, the flicker of the fluorescent lights above, it felt like a battlefield. I sat there for hours. My pulse was thrumming in my ears every time I turned a page, just waiting for the one mistake that would crack their world open. And then, I saw it. I saw a name I recognized. An old logistics partner from Bristol who had been run out of business 10 years ago. Grayson hadn't just made an enemy of me. He had crossed the one man in the city who could verify his embezzlement. I felt a grim smile tug at the corners of my mouth as I made the first of many phone calls. The war hadn't started yet, but I was already moving the pieces into place. One evening, the static of our disconnected lives finally shattered into a scream. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen cutting through the dark with a harsh, clinical glow. When I answered, honestly, all I heard was a ragged, wet sob. It was the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop through the floor. "He threw away my paints, Dad," she choked out. Her voice was muffled, as if she were hiding in a closet. "Every single tube, every canvas. He said the nursery needed the space, and he didn't want the baby exposed to low-class hobbies." My blood didn't just boil. It turned into a pressurized steam that made my vision blur at the edges. I gripped the phone so hard the plastic casing actually groaned under my palm. My knuckles were white, prominent. "Come home, Daisy," I rasped. My voice sounded like gravel. "I still have your room exactly the way you left it. Just get in a cab and come back to Bristol." The silence that followed, it was longer than any I've ever known. Just a heavy, suffocating void. "I can't," she finally whispered. And the sheer hopelessness in those two words, it broke something inside me. "He told me if I leave, his high-priced lawyers will make sure I never see the baby. He says I'm mentally unstable, Dad. He showed me files he's been keeping. Diaries I wrote when I was 15. Old medical records from when I had the flu. He's twisting every little thing to look like a breakdown." The trap was shut, bolted, electrified. They hadn't just isolated her. They had weaponized her own history against her. They were threatening her with the one thing she loved more than her own life, her unborn child. I sat there, in the dark. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of my old wall clock, and I realized a head-on collision wasn't going to work. If I stormed that townhouse, like the aggressive working-class father-in-law they already expected me to be, they'd have me in handcuffs before I even reached the foyer. I had to be smarter than them, which, as it turns out, isn't that hard when you're dealing with people blinded by their own reflected glow. I started playing the long game. I adopted the persona of a defeated, submissive old man who had finally learned his place. I'd call Grayson and apologize for overstepping. My voice was practiced, humble. I even sent fawning gifts to Beatrice that I knew she'd find appropriately quaint. It tasted like ash in my mouth every time I had to smile at them through a video call. But I needed them to lower their guard. I needed them to stop seeing me as a threat and start seeing me as a background character in their grand play. While they were busy patting themselves on the back for taming me, I was quietly liquidating my life. I sold the Bristol house to a developer in a hush-hush deal and moved my retirement funds into offshore accounts that Grayson's firm couldn't sniff out. Nobody in that circle realized that the guy in the oil-stained corduroy jacket had hit it big in logistics tech back in the early 2000s. I had money, real, liquid, heavy-hitting cash, not the leverage to the eyeballs debt that the Sterlings used to buy their custom suits. I kept driving my 10-year-old sedan, the muffler rattling like a can of nails, while I sat on a war chest that could buy and sell Grayson's entire lifestyle twice over. The breaking point arrived in late November, a bitter, bone-deep winter that seemed to suck the heat right out of your lungs. Daisy was 8 months along by then. Her belly was large, and her ankles were so swollen she could barely shuffle across the floor. She was exhausted, just a shell of the girl who used to hike the hills with me. Yet Grayson, he was still demanding she perform for his partners. He was hosting a high-stakes dinner and graciously gave Daisy a budget to buy a new dress. Though, honestly, the amount was an insult. It was a measly 50 pounds. Hardly enough for a decent pair of shoes, let alone a gown from the boutiques he insisted she frequent. It was a blatant setup, a psychological test designed to make her feel small and incompetent when she inevitably failed to meet his impossible standards. Daisy thought she'd found a loophole. She discovered a deep navy silk dress that accommodated her bump perfectly, even if it was 50 pounds over his allowance. She used the emergency cash I'd tucked into her coat pocket months ago to cover the difference. She actually sounded proud when she told me about it. A tiny flicker of the old Daisy peeking through the fog. She thought she'd finally solved a problem on her own. The dinner was a roaring success, at least according to the social media posts. Beatrice was plastered all over. I wasn't invited, of course, but I spent the evening parked 3 houses down. The heater in my car was barely keeping the frost off the windshield. I watched the shadows move behind those expensive curtains, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. When the last guest finally pulled away in their Range Rover, the mask didn't just slip, it was ripped off. Grayson didn't yell. That would be too common for a Sterling. He just went ice cold. His voice was a razor-thin blade as he demanded the receipt for the dress. "You stole from me," he said. The words echoed through the hallway like a death sentence. Daisy tried to explain. She told him she'd used my money, the emergency fund I'd given her. But that only made the fire in his eyes burn brighter. "So, you're taking handouts from your father now? You're making me look like I can't provide for my own wife?" His ego was a fragile, terrifying thing. It couldn't handle the idea of a logistics manager having more utility than him. He took that receipt and flicked it into the fireplace. I can imagine him watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames. Beatrice sat in the corner, her pearls shimmering in the firelight, and let out a dry, cruel laugh. "She needs to learn the value of a pound, Grayson," she remarked, taking a slow sip of her brandy. "The girl has been spoiled rotten." Spoiled? My daughter? The girl who worked 2 jobs just to get through university? Grayson looked at Daisy with a level of disgust that makes my stomach turn even now. "The dress goes," he hissed. The humiliation was dripping from every syllable. "And since you can't follow simple instructions, you need a reminder of exactly where you stand in this house." He demanded she take the dress off. Right there, in the middle of the living room. He was using his favorite weapon, shame, to break whatever was left of her spirit. Daisy found a shred of her old self, the girl who used to stare down bullies in the Bristol docks. She refused. She didn't scream. Honestly, she just turned her back on him. She tried to navigate her 8-month bump toward the banister, trying to find the safety of the stairs. But Grayson? His hand shot out like a viper. His fingers clamped around her upper arm with a calculated pressure. It wasn't the kind of grip that leaves a purple bruise for a doctor to find, but it was enough to jerk her to a dead halt. He leaned in close. I can only imagine his breath smelled like that high-end Pinot Noir. He hissed in her ear, telling her she would learn respect if it was the last thing he ever taught her. I was sitting in my sedan, just 3 houses down. The interior smelled like stale upholstery and the bitter dregs of cold gas station coffee. Then, the front door of the Sterling Manor swung open. It threw a rectangular slab of warm amber light across the wet porch. I leaned forward. I was squinting, tracking every movement. I fully expected to see one of his posh partners making a late exit. Instead, I saw a flash of navy silk, a figure stumbling out into the biting November air. It was Daisy. The horror didn't hit me until I saw Grayson's silhouette loom in the doorway. His arm was extended in a sharp, dismissive shove. "You want to wear that expensive dress so badly? Fine. Wear it outside. Maybe the freezing air will clear your head and remind you who pays the bills?" His voice carried clearly through the damp night, and before she could even turn around, that heavy oak door thudded shut. I heard it. That unmistakable metallic Times, clack asterisk, the deadbolt sliding home. Within seconds, the sky just opened up. It started dumping a freezing, sleeting rain that turned the world into a gray blur. Daisy stood there for a heartbeat. Her hands were frantically beating against the wood. Her voice was a thin, ragged plea that the wind just tried to swallow. "Grayson, please. It's freezing. The baby. Please just let me get my coat." Her breath was forming these frantic white plumes in the dark. Inside the house, the scene was disgusting. Through those tall, narrow windows, I could see the soft glow of the chandelier. I could see the shadows of Grayson and Beatrice moving toward the liquor cabinet. They were pouring glasses of brandy. Their movements were relaxed to fluid. They were completely ignoring the pregnant woman shivering on their doorstep like a stray dog. Daisy's legs finally gave out. Her swollen ankles just buckled under the weight and the shock. She didn't have a coat. She certainly didn't have shoes. She was standing in nothing but silk stockings on the jagged, ice-cold cobblestones of the driveway. She collapsed, her body instinctually curling into a tight ball. She was trying to shield her stomach from the sleet with her own thin arms. The sight of my son-in-law making my pregnant daughter kneel in the mud over a 50-pound price tag, it snapped something in the back of my brain. I didn't feel red rage. Red is for bar fights, for impulsive mistakes. This was white. It was absolute, blinding clarity. It stripped away 30 years of keeping my head down. I threw the car door open. The hinge actually screamed in protest. And I didn't just run. I sprinted. My work boots splashed through freezing puddles. The heavy, rhythmic thud of my heart was drowning out the sound of the storm. I reached her in seconds. I dropped to my knees, feeling the icy sludge soak right through my trousers. She was turning a terrifying shade of blue. Her teeth were chattering with a violent metallic sound that made my skin crawl. Her eyes were glazed, unfocused. As she looked up at me through the rain, "Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," she stuttered. Her voice was a ghost of a sound. Think about that. She was freezing to death on her own property, and her first instinct, conditioned by months of psychological warfare, was to apologize to me times for being a burden. That apology was the final nail in the coffin of the old Clint. I stripped off my heavy, grease-stained work coat and wrapped it around her. I wanted the warmth of my own body heat trapped in that lining. I hauled her up. Her body felt like dead weight. I steered her toward the car. "Get in. Crank the heat to the max," I commanded. My voice, it was devoid of any emotion. She wept into the upholstery. Her hands were clawing at the dashboard. "He has my keys, my phone." "I have nothing, Dad," she sobbed. I leaned in. My eyes locked onto the warm, inviting lights of the Sterling living room. "You won't need them," I said. The words fell like stones. "You're never going back in there for a single thing they own." I settled her into the passenger seat. I made sure the locks were engaged. And then, I turned back toward the house. I didn't walk. I marched. I didn't bother with the doorbell. And I sure as hell wasn't going to knock. I reached the porch. I took a single breath of the frozen air, and I drove my boot into the center of that solid oak door, right where the lock met the frame. Adrenaline is a hell of a drug. It makes a 60-year-old man feel like a wrecking ball. It took 2 kicks, 2 massive, bone-jarring impacts that sent splinters of expensive wood flying into the foyer like shrapnel. The door gave way with a sickening crash. It swung wide to reveal the refined world of the Sterlings. The smell of expensive wood smoke and aged cognac hit me as I stepped over the threshold. A muddy, soaked demon invading their sanctuary. It was 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, and I was looking at the man who had just left my daughter to freeze in the mud. I lifted my head. I ignored the screaming of Beatrice, and I prepared to say the 5 words that would signal the end of their dynasty. I lifted my head, ignored the screaming from Beatrice, and I prepared to say the 5 words that would signal the absolute end of their dynasty. Grayson's hand jerked. His expensive crystal tumbler slipped right through his fingers, shattering against the hardwood. The sound was like a gunshot in the sudden silence of the foyer. Shards of glass skittering across the floor toward my muddy boots. Beatrice let out a sound that was half gasp, half shriek, her skeletal fingers clutching those precious pearls so hard, I actually thought the string might snap. Honestly, they stared at me like I was a glitch in their matrix. A soaked, grease-stained demon from the old world who had finally breached their gates. "What do you think you're doing?" Grayson finally shouted. His voice cracked on the last syllable as he tried to pull his dignity out of the gutter. "I'll have you arrested for breaking and entering, you senile old fool." I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I just walked right into his personal bubble, stopping only when I was inches from his perfectly groomed face. I could see the tiny beads of sweat forming on his upper lip, the way his pupils dilated as the primitive realization of fight or flight finally overrode his legal training. I saw the flicker of raw, unadulterated fear in his eyes, and honestly, it was the most beautiful thing I'd seen all year. "You have lost everything today," I said. My voice was as steady as a heartbeat. Those were the words. I wanted them to hang in the air, like a prophecy wrapped in a thread. Grayson tried to sneer, but the muscle in his jaw was twitching uncontrollably. It betrayed the terror he was trying to suppress. "Get out," he managed to bark, though the command carried all the authority of a wet paper bag. "Take your trash daughter and get the hell out of my sight." "Oh, I'm taking her," I said. A terrifyingly calm smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. "And I'm taking a souvenir too." I reached out and snatched a Ming Dynasty replica vase off the hallway table, the one Beatrice treated like a holy relic. Before she could even process the movement, I opened my hand and just let it plummet. It hit the floor with a heavy, final thud, exploding into 1,000 pieces of porcelain confetti. "You're insane. That was priceless," Beatrice shrieked. Her voice reached a frequency that made my ears ring. I looked her dead in the eye. My hands were steady, and my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. "I'm a father," I corrected. My tone was like ice. "And you too. You have made a grave miscalculation about what a father is willing to do when his child is in the rain." I turned my back on them and walked out into the sleet. Behind me, the splintered remains of their front door creaked on the hinges. I got back into the sedan. The interior was now a humid sanctuary of heater blast and Daisy's quiet, rhythmic sobbing. We didn't go to the municipal hospital where Grayson's firm held sway over the board of directors. Instead, I drove 3 hours to a private clinic where I'd already prepaid for a suite under a different name. We spent the night watching the monitors. The rhythmic times, thump-thump times, of the baby's heart filling the sterile room. He was fine. A little fighter who didn't care about social standing or budget-friendly dresses. By the time the sun started to bleed through the gray clouds the next morning, the war had officially begun. Grayson, predictable as a Swiss watch, spent the day filing police reports for the door and emergency custody papers, citing Daisy's documented instability. He actually thought he was winning the opening gambit. The poor bastard. He had no idea I'd spent months turning his own world into a minefield. Remember those weeks I spent digging through the public records office? I hadn't just discovered his debt. No, I had hunted down exactly who held the paper on his life. His mortgage hadn't been with a local bank for months. It had been bundled and sold to a private equity firm that specialized in distressed assets, a company called Archon Holdings. What Grayson didn't know, because I'd paid a king's ransom in legal fees to keep it buried, was that Archon Holdings had been acquired by a silent investor 2 weeks prior. That investor? It was me. While he was busy practicing his victim speech for the police, I was sending a very specific dossier to his partners at the law firm. It contained every digital breadcrumb of the embezzlement he'd been using to bridge the gap between his ego and his bank account. The fallout was, well, it was a masterclass in efficiency. 3 days after he'd pushed my daughter into the rain, Grayson walked into his corner office to find his senior partners sitting in the dark. They didn't offer him a seat or a chance to explain. They just handed him a box for his desk and a termination letter that cited moral turpitude. He was out on the street by 10 in the morning, his reputation dissolving like sugar in the rain. But the real blow, the one I'd been savoring, it hit at noon. He pulled his BMW up to the townhouse. The one symbol of status he had left, only to find the locks, had been replaced with industrial-grade cylinders. A bailiff in a high-vis vest was standing on the porch, a clipboard in his hand, and a very bored expression on his face. "What is this?" Grayson demanded. His face was turning a mottled purple. "Get off my property. This is my house." The bailiff didn't even look up from his paperwork. "Actually, sir," he said, his voice flat and professional, "this property has been foreclosed by the lien holder due to a major breach of contract and a total failure to maintain required insurance." Grayson looked like he'd been hit with a taser. "I have insurance. I've had it for years," he yelled. His voice echoed off the neighboring townhouses. He didn't, though. I'd seen the lapse notice in the files I'd acquired weeks ago. He'd let the policy drop to free up the cash for that bloated wedding, thinking he could just restart it after the next bonus hit. It was a standard clause in his mortgage. Immediate foreclosure upon a lapse in coverage. He stood there on the sidewalk, his expensive leather briefcase at his feet, realizing that the walls were finally closing in. He scrambled for his phone, his fingers shaking as he dialed the holding company, demanding to speak to the man who had pulled the rug out from under him. I let it ring 3 times. Before I picked up, absolute, terrified silence. That was all I got from him for a good 10 seconds. Honestly, I imagine him standing there on that sidewalk, watching the bailiff haul a designer sofa out toward the curb, realizing that the quaint old man he'd spent a year mocking was actually the architect of his total destruction. You own the note?" he finally stammered. His voice, it jumped an entire octave. It was the sound of a bully, realizing he'd been playing checkers, while the person he despised was playing high-stakes poker with the house's money. "I own the note, Grayson. I own the debt. I own the deed to the roof that's no longer over your head. And most importantly, I own the digital paper trail of every single pound you embezzled from your partners just to keep Beatrice in pearls." Daisy reached out then. Her fingers just barely brushed the edge of the phone, as if she couldn't believe the monster on the other end was finally, truly being silenced. I watched her exhale, a long, shaky breath that seemed to discharge months and months of accumulated terror. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as I looked out the window at the rolling green hills of our new life. "Because I am a remarkably generous man, Grayson. I am giving you exactly 1 exit ramp," I continued. My tone was conversational, but as sharp as a meat cleaver. "Option 1, you sign over full, irrevocable custody of the child to Daisy. You renounce every parental right you think you have, and you leave the country by sunset tomorrow. Option 2, I hand the dossier sitting on my desk to the Crown Prosecution Service, and we see how well a sterling fares in a 6x8 cell." He didn't even try to negotiate. Honestly, bullies are surprisingly efficient at surrendering once they realize they're completely outgunned. The sound of his pen scratching against the legal documents I'd sent via courier, It was the most satisfying thing I've ever heard. He fled to Spain within 48 hours, just to dodge the inevitable fraud investigation. He left behind a trail of debt and broken promises that even the prominent Sterling name couldn't fix. Beatrice didn't fare much better. With the townhouse gone and Grayson's accounts frozen, that armor of pearls finally cracked. She ended up in a cramped council flat in Luton, a place where, let's be real, no one cares which fork you use for the salad. I heard she still tries to act like royalty at the local market, but reality has a way of being a lot louder than a fake accent. A few weeks later, under the soft, warm glow of a nursery lamp that smelled like lavender and new beginnings, Daisy gave birth to a healthy baby boy. We named him Leo. He's got my eyes that stubborn, watchful glint, but he's inherited his mother's gentle spirit, the kind of spirit that hasn't been extinguished by the rain. Watching him sleep in his crib, I feel a peace that I didn't think was possible for a man who's spent his entire life moving freight. Daisy has started painting again, though, I have to say, the canvases in her new studio look a lot different than the ones Grayson threw in the trash. They're darker, sure, lots of deep navies and stormy grays. But the brushstrokes? They're aggressive, they're confident. She isn't painting pretty things anymore. She's painting the truth. And I can tell that with every single stroke. She's reclaiming another piece of her soul. Grayson is a ghost now. A bad memory that's been washed away by a few good seasons of rain and a lot of quiet mornings. Sometimes, when I'm holding my grandson and the house is filled with the smell of fresh bread and oil paints, I think about the choice I had to make. It would have been so much easier to stay in my lane, to say it wasn't my business, or to let the professionals handle it. But family? Family isn't a passive concept. It's a commitment to action. Love is a verb that requires you to get your boots muddy and, if necessary, kick down a few doors. If you're reading this and you feel that cold, familiar rain on your neck, if you see someone you love being erased right in front of you, don't wait for the universe to balance the scales. Be the person who acts. Be the one who builds a war chest in the shadows and waits for the perfect moment to strike. Because at the end of the day, the bullies only win if we agree to follow their schedules. I'm Clint. And I'm telling you right now, you have way more power than they want you to believe. Subscribe if you stand for the truth. And never, ever let them tell you that you're just anything.